If you've ever wondered why your nose looks more like your dad's while your siblings inherited mom's, scientists have finally cracked the genetic code behind it. And what they found reveals something even more extraordinary. Your nose shape might actually come from Neanderthals. For generations, people have noticed that noses run in families. You look at your mother, your grandmother, your aunts, and there it is. That same distinctive shape, that same bridge width, those same nostrils. It's one of those family traits that seem so obvious, so inevitable, that we never really thought much about why it happens. Your nose is yours, because your parents' noses shaped yours. Simple genetics, right? But the truth, as it turns out, is far more complex and infinitely more fascinating than we ever imagined. For decades, scientists knew that facial features were heritable. They understood that genes played a role, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly which genes controlled what. They couldn't explain why some people have broad noses while others have narrow ones. They couldn't tell you which specific DNA sequences determined whether your nose bridge was wide or thin, whether your nostrils flared out or were compressed, whether your nose came to a point or had a rounded tip. The genetic blueprint for the human face remained largely a mystery, locked away in billions of base pairs of DNA that we couldn't quite decode. Then, in 2016, everything changed. An international team of researchers led by scientists at University College London decided to tackle this problem head-on. But instead of studying Europeans, who had been the focus of most facial genetics research up until that point, they recruited over 6,000 people from Latin America. These volunteers had diverse ancestry, some with European heritage, some with Native American ancestry, some with African roots, and many with a mixture of all three. This genetic diversity was crucial. It meant they could identify genes that controlled facial features across different populations, not just within one ethnic group. The researchers took photographs of all these volunteers and measured 14 different facial features with precision. They looked at the width of the nose bridge. They measured the distance between nostrils. They assessed how much the nose protruded. They examined the angle of the nasal tip. They documented every measurable aspect of nose shape that varied from person to person. Then, they took DNA samples from each volunteer and ran a genome-wide association study, comparing the genetic variations they found with the facial measurements they had recorded. What emerged from this massive analysis was revolutionary. 4 genes stood out with unmistakable clarity as major controllers of nose shape. These weren't obscure genes that nobody had heard of. They were genes with established roles in bone and cartilage development, and each one controlled a specific aspect of how your nose looks. The first of these genes was called GLI3. This gene has the strongest signal for determining the breadth of your nostrils. If you inherit certain variants of GLI3, your nostrils tend to be wider. It controls cartilage growth in the nasal region, and this growth directly influences how wide the opening between your nostrils is. GLI3 didn't get its power by accident. Scientists discovered that this gene shows rapid evolution in humans compared to our ancient relatives like Neanderthals. This means that over the last several thousand years, natural selection has been actively shaping this gene, changing which variants are common in different populations. Then there's PAX1, which also influences nostril breadth. PAX1 works alongside GLI3 to determine your nostril size. It's another gene involved in cartilage growth and development, and when you inherit the right combination of variants in both GLI3 and PAX1, you end up with notably broader nostrils. For people with broad noses, these 2 genes are likely doing much of the heavy lifting. The third gene is called DCHS2, and it controls something different, the pointiness of your nose. DCHS2 determines how much your nose protrudes, the angle at which the tip points, and the overall projection of your nose from your face. It's all about that cartilage growth again, sculpting how far forward your nose extends and what shape that extension takes. DCHS2 also shows evidence of rapid evolution in modern humans, suggesting that the shape of our noses has been under strong natural selection pressure. And then there's RUNX2, which takes control of something structural, bone growth. While the other genes focus on cartilage, RUNX2 is all about the bony framework of your nose. It determines the width of your nasal bridge and its height. RUNX2 also shows signs of recent selection in human evolution, indicating that the shape of our nasal bone structure has mattered to our survival and reproduction. Now here's where it gets truly remarkable. When researchers analyzed these 4 genes, they discovered something unexpected. The genes that control nose shape in modern humans show unmistakable signatures of natural selection. This isn't random variation. This is evolution actively shaping our noses. And the question became, why? Why would natural selection care so much about nose shape? The answer lies in climate adaptation. For thousands of years, human populations lived in different environments across the globe. People who stayed in Africa lived in warm, humid climates. People who migrated to Europe encountered cold, dry climates. People who settled in Asia experienced yet other conditions. And their noses adapted to their environments. Think about what your nose actually does. Beyond being a prominent feature on your face, Your nose is a sophisticated air processing system. When you breathe in through your nostrils, the air doesn't go straight to your lungs. It first travels through your nasal cavity, where it's warmed, humidified, and filtered. This conditioning of the air is crucial. Cold, dry air can damage your lungs if it reaches them unconditioned. So your nose warms it up and adds moisture to it. In cold, dry climates like Northern Europe, this function becomes even more important. You need an efficient system for warming and humidifying the air you breathe. A narrower nose, it turns out, is more efficient at this task. The air spends more time in the nasal cavity, moving through a narrower passage, which means it has more contact with the warm, moist tissues that line your nose. This allows for better heat and moisture transfer. So populations that migrated to cold climates would have benefited from having narrower noses. Individuals with narrower noses would have experienced less respiratory stress, fewer lung problems, potentially better overall health. Over generations, the genes for narrower noses would become more common in these populations. In contrast, people living in warm, humid climates didn't need this intense air conditioning function. The air was already warm and humid. In fact, a narrower nose might have been disadvantageous. A broader nose, with its wider nostrils and greater nasal opening, would provide better airflow and ventilation. It would allow you to breathe more easily in hot conditions, potentially helping with thermoregulation. So in African and other warm climate populations, the genes for broader noses would have had an advantage. This explains why you see such consistent patterns in nose shape across different populations. It's not random, it's not arbitrary. It's the result of tens of thousands of years of natural selection, with different populations adapting their noses to their specific environments. Europeans tend to have narrower noses, Africans tend to have broader noses, East Asians have their own characteristic patterns. And all of this variation comes down to these 4 genes and how they respond to environmental pressures. But here's where the story takes an absolutely astounding turn. When scientists looked more deeply at the genes controlling nose shape, they made a discovery that seemed almost impossible. Some of the genetic variants that influence nose shape didn't come from modern humans at all. They came from Neanderthals. This brings us to one of the most remarkable scientific revelations of the 21st century. In 2010, scientists sequenced the complete Neanderthal genome. What they found shocked everyone. Modern humans, you and me, and everyone alive today, carry pieces of Neanderthal DNA in our genome. We have roughly 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA mixed into our genetic code. This DNA got there because, starting around 50,000 years ago, modern humans who migrated out of Africa encountered Neanderthals who were already living in Europe and Western Asia. And these 2 species, despite being distinct species, interbred. At the time, many scientists thought this interbreeding would have been a disaster. They assumed that any Neanderthal DNA that got mixed into the human genome would be harmful or useless. But as geneticists have studied this ancient DNA more carefully, they've discovered something unexpected. Some Neanderthal DNA has actually been beneficial. It's been preserved in our genome because it helped our ancestors survive and thrive. And in 2023, an international research team made a stunning discovery. Some of that Neanderthal DNA directly influences the shape of your nose. The researchers looked at a specific genomic region called 1Q32.3. In this region, they found genetic variants that showed clear evidence of Neanderthal ancestry. When they traced how these variants affected facial features, they found that they were associated with changes in the height of the midface and nose. Specifically, Neanderthal-derived variants at this location contributed to a taller nose, a greater distance from your lip to your nose bridge. Think about what this means. When modern humans left Africa and migrated north into colder climates, they encountered Neanderthals who had already spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to those same cold environments. The Neanderthals' noses were actually quite different from modern human noses. Fossil evidence shows that Neanderthals had... Now here's the remarkable part. These Neanderthal genetic variants that affect nose shape show clear signs of natural selection in modern human populations, meaning that after modern humans acquired this Neanderthal DNA, it was beneficial enough that it spread through populations and became more common over time. The Neanderthal contributions to our nose shape weren't just accidents of interbreeding, they were actually helpful. They gave our ancestors noses that were better adapted to cold climates. Some scientists have even suggested that these Neanderthal variants might have facilitated adaptation to cold environments by being linked to genes that affect body fat distribution and metabolism. This wasn't the only time that DNA from ancient humans shaped our faces. In 2021, the same research team discovered that Denisovans, another extinct human species, contributed genetic material that influences lip shape. So we now have evidence of at least 2 different ancient human species leaving their mark on modern human facial features through genetic introgression. Understanding this history of nose-shaped genetics opens up fascinating questions about human evolution and adaptation. It shows us that our faces are not fixed, unchanging features. They're the product of evolution, shaped by environmental pressures and ancient interbreeding events. The fact that so many of us carry Neanderthal DNA that influences our nose shape is a humbling reminder of our deep connection to extinct human species. For most of human history, people never knew any of this. They simply inherited their parents' noses and passed them along to their children, unaware of the vast genetic machinery underlying these family resemblances. They might have noticed that the women in their family tended to have narrower noses, or that the men all had broad noses, or that their children seemed to inherit their nose shapes in various combinations. But the mechanism, the actual DNA sequences doing the work, remained invisible. Now we can see it. We can identify the specific genes, we can understand how they work, and remarkably, we can even predict nose shape from DNA alone. In 2025, researchers published a breakthrough study in which they created an artificial intelligence model that could reconstruct three-dimensional facial images directly from DNA data. They called this model DIFACE. It uses advanced neural networks and diffusion models to take DNA sequences and generate a complete 3D representation of what a person's face would look like. When they tested this system, they found something striking. And the nose was the facial feature with the strongest genetic associations. In other words, of all the features on your face, your eyes, your lips, your chin, your cheeks, your nose shape is the most determined by your genes. Researchers identified over 107 genetic variants associated with different nose traits. Compare this to other facial features, and the nose stands out as having an outsized genetic influence. Your nose shape is more heritable than almost any other aspect of your face. This is particularly evident when you look at populations from different parts of the world. East Asian populations, for example, tend to have characteristic flatter and broader noses. This isn't because they're raised differently or because of any cultural factors. It's because different populations have different frequencies of the genetic variants that influence nose shape. Specific genetic variants that produce broader noses are more common in East Asian populations. These variants became more common in these populations because they were advantageous in the climates where these populations lived. But here's an important point. Even though different populations have different average nose shapes, all of these differences are controlled by the same underlying genes, GLI3, DCHS2, RUNX2, PAX1, and others. The biological processes are identical across all human populations. It's just that the frequencies of different genetic variants differ between populations. A person from Europe and a person from Africa and a person from East Asia all have the same genes controlling nose shape. They just carry different versions, different variants of those genes. This understanding has practical applications that extend far beyond satisfying scientific curiosity. In forensic investigations, DNA could potentially be used to predict facial features and help identify unknown individuals. If investigators have DNA from a crime scene, but no photograph of the suspect, they might be able to use DNA analysis to predict what the person's nose looks like, their lip shape, their cheekbone prominence, and other distinguishing features. This could help narrow down suspects or build a more complete picture of what someone looks like based on their DNA alone. The research also has implications for medical genetics. Rare mutations in these nose-shaping genes can cause facial abnormalities and birth defects. By understanding how these genes normally function in controlling nose development, doctors can better understand what goes wrong when these genes are mutated. This knowledge can help in genetic counseling, helping families understand the risks of inheriting certain genetic conditions that affect facial development. For plastic surgery, this research opens up new possibilities. A surgeon performing a rhinoplasty, nose surgery, now understands the genetic basis of different nose shapes. This knowledge can help surgeons preserve features that are important to a person's ethnic identity while still achieving the aesthetic goals the patient wants. It's a reminder that nose shapes that might be considered unattractive in one culture might be highly valued in another, and that genetic diversity in human nose shapes is something to be appreciated rather than erased. But beyond these practical applications, there's something profoundly moving about understanding the genetic basis of nose shape. It connects us to our evolutionary history. When you look at your nose in the mirror, you're not just seeing a random feature, you're seeing the product of thousands of years of evolution, of your ancestors adapting to their environments, of genetic variants that were preserved because they helped people survive. If you carry Neanderthal DNA that influences your nose shape, and many of us do, you're literally carrying a piece of an extinct species inside your own body. The genes that shape your nose are a record of human history. They tell the story of populations migrating around the globe, of climate adaptation, of natural selection, sculpting human features in response to environmental demands. They tell the story of contact between different human species and the genetic mixing that resulted. They tell the story of how evolution works not in abstract terms, but in the specific features of your face. Think about your own family for a moment. Look at photographs of your parents, your grandparents, your extended family. You'll likely see patterns. Maybe your nose is almost identical to your father's. Maybe your siblings have completely different nose shapes. Maybe you see echoes of your grandmother's nose bridge in your own face, or your uncle's broad nostrils in your children. What you're seeing are the results of genetic inheritance, of these powerful genes being passed down and recombining in different ways in each generation. Now you can understand the mechanism behind those family resemblances. You know that it's GLI3 and PAX1 determining nostril width, DCHS2 determining how much your nose protrudes, RUNX2 determining bridge height. You know that these genes show evidence of natural selection, which means that your specific nose shape was probably beneficial to your ancestors in some way. You know that if you have Neanderthal ancestry, which most non-African people do, some of the genetic variants influencing your nose shape came from an extinct human species. This knowledge changes how we think about human diversity. Instead of seeing different nose shapes as simply different, with some considered more attractive or more desirable, we can understand them as adaptations. We can appreciate the remarkable fact that human noses vary across populations, because different populations evolved in different environments. The broad noses common in African populations aren't somehow inferior to the narrow noses common in European populations. They're differently adapted. Each type of nose represents thousands of years of evolution fine-tuning nasal anatomy to match the climate where a population lived. The research into the genetics of nose shape also reveals how much we still have to learn about human genetics and evolution. For centuries, we looked at people and made assumptions about why they looked the way they did. We didn't have the tools to actually understand the genetic basis of our appearance. We relied on observation and speculation. Now we're entering an era where we can read the actual genetic code and understand in molecular detail why people look the way they do. Scientists continue to discover new genetic variants associated with nose shape. The four major genes, GLI3, DCHS2, RUNX2, and PAX1, are just the most significant ones. There are likely dozens of other genes, each with smaller effects, that also influence nose morphology. There are epigenetic factors that can influence how genes are expressed. There are interactions between genes that we're still working to understand. The full picture of nose shape genetics is far more complex than we can currently see. But what we can see is clear enough. Your nose shape is not random. It's not arbitrary. It's the product of evolution and genetics, shaped by the environments your ancestors lived in and by the genetic mixing that occurred between different human populations. When you look at your nose and see a family resemblance, you're seeing genetics in action. When you notice that your nose is different from your sibling's nose, you're seeing the results of genetic recombination and the random assortment of chromosomes that occurs in sexual reproduction. If you've ever wondered why your nose looks more like your dad's than your mom's, you now know. It's because you inherited the specific variants of GLI3, DCHS2, RUNX2, and PAX1 that he carries, rather than the variants your mother carries. If you wonder why your nose is broader or narrower than your partner's, it's because your two sets of genetic variants produce different effects. If you've looked at your child's nose and seen echoes of both your features and your partner's features combined in new ways, you're seeing the genetic shuffling that happens when two people's DNA combines to create a new individual. This understanding of nose-shaped genetics is part of a larger revolution in human genetics. We're moving into an era where we can read the genetic code and understand, with increasing precision, why people look the way they do, what diseases they might be prone to, how their bodies might respond to different medications, and countless other details about their biology. It's an era of genetic personalization and precision medicine, but it's also an era where we have to be careful about how we use this knowledge. Understanding that nose shape is genetically influenced does not mean that one nose shape is better than another. It doesn't mean that genetic variation in nose shape is a problem that needs to be fixed. It means that we can appreciate the remarkable evolutionary history encoded in our faces. It means we can understand human diversity not as something random or unimportant, but as something shaped by evolution and worthy of appreciation. The discovery that your nose shape comes from your genes, and potentially from Neanderthal genes, is a perfect example of how modern science reveals the incredible complexity and beauty of human biology. It turns out that the answer to the simple question, why does my nose look like my dad's, is connected to tens of thousands of years of human evolution, to adaptation to different climates, to interbreeding between different human species, to the process of natural selection, sculpting human features in response to environmental demands. Next time you look in the mirror or at a family photograph, take a moment to appreciate your nose. That nose is a record of your family's evolutionary history. It tells the story of where your ancestors came from, what climates they adapted to, and how they survived in different parts of the world. And if you carry Neanderthal DNA, which statistically is quite likely if you have non-African ancestry, then part of your nose shape comes from an extinct human species, reminding us that we're the product of a deep and complex evolutionary history that connects us not just to other living humans, but to species that walked the earth tens of thousands of years ago. That's the remarkable science behind your nose.